Chapter 1. The Theists and Science. God that arises from time to time the question of God, his existence or non-existence. People ask what is the ultimate origin of life. Hinduism, in endeavoring to solve the problem, traces the origin of life to a mystical parameter from which emanate all atmas or souls that transmigrate from existence to existence until they are finally reabsorbed in Paramatma. Theistic creeds, like Christianity, for example, in attempting to give an explanation, attribute everything to the fiat of an almighty God. But before we direct our energies to solving the riddle of the universe, it is as well that we begin by asking what is implied by God, as theists are themselves confused in their minds on this question. Is God, for instance, a personal God as depicted in the guise of an old man with long white hair and beard, and flowing robes pictured in the paintings of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel in Rome and the Cathedral of Chalons, or as depicted in the ecclesiastical dress with a bishop's mitre in the church La Chapels at Crecy? Or is God a supernatural force? Either way, the difficulties are great and innumerable for anyone to surmount. Notwithstanding their theories, theists also assert that eminent scientists testify to the presence or existence of God. However eminent, sincere, and unprejudiced such scientists may be, such certifications are not a scientific method of approach to the question of whether God exists. The medieval philosophers and their ancestors, Descartes, Berkeley, Leibniz, and Spinoza, maintained, it is true, that the existence of God could be demonstrated by logical reasoning. But these so-called classical proofs of God's existence, including the much vaunted metaphysical and teleological arguments of theologian Aquinas, received such devastating treatment at the hands of Kant that they need not be resurrected today. Hermann Minkowski, resorting to mathematics, proved that if we accept the velocity of light as constant, then the measuring instruments must have undergone a change as a result of their motion. He showed that when the velocity of the observer is increased, his distance begins to shorten and his time intervals begin to lengthen, so that when he attains the speed of light, his distance will dwindle down to zero and his time intervals will extend to eternity. This makes the existence of God a definite possibility, for God alone is represented as being eternally present everywhere at the same time. Unfortunately, however, for the theist, Minkowski also proved mathematically that the velocity of light is a critical velocity that can never be attained by any physical force. Thus, Minkowski proved mathematically that, even as a force, God does not exist. It may be mentioned here, however, that while the West always keeps thinking in terms of physical forces, and seems unable, as yet, to alter its materialistic theory, in the East, Buddhist psychology taught so long as 2,500 years ago that thought has an infinite velocity. That is to say, that it could transcend time and space, overcoming all barriers. It is a faculty which, when developed, enables one to penetrate, for instance, into the most secret recesses of other people's hearts, see how people die and are reborn in other spheres of existence, see distant objects clairvoyance, hear distant sounds clairaudience, go through physical barriers, walk on water, traverse through space, etc. magical powers. In Buddhist parlance, these powers are known as the Paka Abhaya, i.e., the 5 supernormal powers. Dr. J. B.N. Ryan, the U.S. scientist, is now conducting certain experiments in extrasensory perception, in that branch of science known as parapsychology, seeking to explain telepathy, precognition, etc. And it may perhaps be only a matter of time before the West too proves conclusively what the East has all the time known, namely, that mind is supreme in all human activity. Mano Babangam Dhamma Banasetha Manamaya, said the Buddha, meaning thereby that all states arising have a mind for their cause. Of mind are the offspring. Let us digress for a while to clarify this statement. Mind is certainly, as the Buddha taught, supreme in all human activities, and the primary aim of mental exercise is to bring the mind to a state of one-pointedness. Thereafter, transcending 4 stages of the space-time continuum of phenomental perception, one reaches the timeless and unconditioned state, known to Buddhists as Nibbana. If we are to view phenomena objectively, our minds must be unconditioned and outside the causal process, and that is the aim of every Buddhist. For the mind that is circumscribed by ideas imposes limits, as it were, or phenomena, or events in the continuum of space and time, and we therefore use such conventional modes of expression as past, present, and future because our minds are still circumscribed by concepts. We are still within the subject-object relationship. When a yogi, for instance, through mental exercise attains one-pointedness samadhi in the fourth jhana, he begins to transcend the limits of time and space imposed by our conceptual thinking, and develops the faculty referred to earlier as the panca abhina, which enables him to see and to hear what we do not. This faculty is the natural outcome of one's ability to concentrate on one point to the exclusion of all distracting sensations that normally arise in ordinary thinking. Hence, such a person's insight is beyond the capacity of ordinary mortals, though, of course, he too still remains within the subject-object relationship. There are sects in every country who try to gain control of the vital forces in nature, whether among the Jains, the Hindus, the early Christians in the Hermetic lodges of Egypt where Christianity first took root, or among the early Buddhists and Brahmins inhabiting the eastern valley of the Ganges in the time of the Buddha. In Egypt, people were trained in the temple of Ma'at to develop the psychic eye, and when they responded to the training, were called seers, because they were able to look into the past and foretell the future. This psychic faculty was called the third eye, and corresponds to one of the 5 supernormal powers, or Paka Abha of Buddhists, with but one fundamental exception. Ancient Egyptians and other seers had a limited vision, extending to a maximum range of 40 kalpas world cycles of time into the past and 40 kalpas into the future. The limited vision was because they had still to destroy what is known to Buddhists as the Asavas defilements, that is, Kamatan sense desires, Bhavatan desire for eternalism, Dihi false views, and Avijja ignorance, which bind beings, however exalted they might be, to the recurring cycles of birth and death. The Buddhist or its capacity to see into the continuum of space and time, on the other hand, is not restricted, but dependent on his attainments. He could see far into space and time. A Pacceka Buddha's vision is even greater than that of an Arahat, but a Supreme Buddha's vision surpasses them all. And he alone possesses an added faculty, namely, the ability to see at a glance what previous good or evil acts Kama conditioned a being's present existence and would condition his future existence. He alone knew when the moment of fruition, the ripening of wisdom, could come. This faculty is peculiar to a Supreme Buddha because he has practiced the 10 perfections paramis to saturation point over a longer period of time than an Arahat, or even a Pacceka Buddha, and has gained excellence in every department of knowledge, mundane and supramundane. Hence, his vision is unsurpassed, both in the realms of gods and among men. They may be likened to 3 types of beings who see with the aid of starlight, moonlight, and sunlight, respectively. Now, in keeping with each individual person's development, there are some among us who we say are psychic. Indeed, to a greater or lesser degree, we are all psychic, but most of us only to an infinitesimal degree. A few there are, however, to a marked degree. The latter have practiced, to a greater or lesser degree in previous incarnations, the mental exercises leading to one-pointedness, though they do not apparently know it now. Equipped thus with a more sensitive mental apparatus than most beings into events in the continuum of space and time. Accordingly, some are able to predict events by merely reading cards or holding an article to their foreheads against the awakened or dormant third eye, which tunes into consciously or unconsciously and commingles with the vibrations emanating from the article. And as these vibrations represent a certain picture or event just as do our thoughts, such folk are able to describe the associations attached to it. The emanations are often so fine and numerous that they continue to be given off for thousands of years, just as with radium. That this is so is evidenced by an episode narrated in the Buddhist scriptures. There was once, we are told, a man, a great yogi, called Vangisa. He was able to tell by merely tapping on a skull where a particular person had been reborn. He was an adept in the science of sound. Many people flocked to him with the skulls of their dead, if only they might hear a word of hope, a word of good cheer. The Buddha, in his compassion, always seeking to lead men onto the path that brings peace through Nibbana, reasoned that so clever a man was likely to grasp his teaching easily. Accordingly, having arranged to produce 3 skulls before Vangisa, he went to see him. Vangisa was naturally flattered, and not a little amused, and so was the populace. For here was the Supreme Buddha himself visiting the yogi, Vangisa, with skulls. The customary greetings were exchanged, and the skulls were produced. Van Geyser, so the story goes, examined the skulls and pronounced that the first skull showed rebirth in the Pitta world Ie, one of the lower ghost purgatorial states. Very well, the Buddha said, you are right. The second skull, Van Geyser said, showed rebirth in the Deva world Ie, a celestial realm. Quite right, agreed the Buddha. But as he made the third skull, Van Geyser was literally stumped. He tried and tried, but could not tell. Thereupon, he inquired of the Buddha if he knew, and the Buddha smilingly replied, yes, I do know, but I will explain only if you will visit me sometime. Van Geyser was an honest man and decided to visit the Buddha, and while expounding the sublime Dhamma, the Buddha explained why the third skull had baffled him. That being, indeed, had actually not been reborn in any one of the 31 states of sentient existence. His Kamma had been brought to a state of perfect balance, and there was no attraction or repulsion. It was the skull of an arahat. Hence, Van Geyser had failed to locate a place of rebirth, for arahats are reborn no more in the world of sentient existence. Since there is no rebirth for an arahat, there were no vibrations linking this skull with a new abode. There being no vibrations, there was no wavelength established too. That is why Van Geyser had failed. And just as a clean cloth from which all stain has been washed away will readily take in the dye, so did Van Geyser obtain, in no long time, the pure and spotless eye for the truth, and he knew, whatsoever has begun in that is inherent also the necessity of dissolution. In other words, Van Geyser too attained the unconditioned, he became another arahat. This briefly explains certain aspects of extrasensory perception like card reading, etc., which work, more or less, on the same principles of modern radar and were known to Buddhists from ancient times. But in certain instances of precognition, where no event is seen before it actually occurs, what really happens is that that person touches momentarily the summits of his former achievements, which through mental exercise had bordered on the unconditioned and timeless. The latter has, indeed, confounded some of the greatest thinkers of our time. Dr. Rhine's research, therefore, into the realms of precognition, when concluded, should be not only interesting but even revealing to many who now, through fear and superstition, believe in divine inspiration. Theists have also tried to learn the second law of thermodynamics in their efforts to maintain the existence of God. Now, what is the second law of thermodynamics? Briefly, this law says that natural processes cannot be reversed. In other words, it means that the universe has been expanding, or going forward, and does not and cannot go backward. The layman of the non-scientific mind can grasp the underlying principle of this law by considering a few simple examples. Say, for instance, a child is born of a woman's womb. According to the law of thermodynamics, this child must develop in a forward direction. That is to say, it cannot go back into the same womb, as it were. No, not at any rate in that incarnation. Take another simple example. Say, a seed is planted, and a tree results. Now, the tree that sprouts forth from the seed cannot get back into that seed again. The process is one of going forward all the time. From this, theists try to argue that as natural processes cannot be reversed, the universe has had a beginning in time, implying creation. In fact, some scientists, in hazarding a guess, have actually calculated the beginning to have occurred about 2 billion years ago. The second law of thermodynamics cannot be challenged. But there is one important weak link in the chain of argument which appears to have been safely ignored by theists and such scientists in their calculations. For, while it is true that scientists have proved that natural processes cannot be reversed, it is also equally scientifically true that the universe has been both expanding and contracting. And this process has been going on for eternity. Where then is the beginning of time that is said to have occurred 2 billion years ago? Thus, if the underlying principle of the second law of thermodynamics is understood, it could be of no practical value or assistance to theists who vainly endeavor to find a beginning in time that might imply creation. Now, let us examine the theistic view a little further. Theists say that God created the earth matter first, and then man mind. But we know that man is to this world what mind is to matter. That is to say, man and his external world are a relationship, for if there is no man, there would be no world as far as he is concerned, and if there is no mind, there would be no matter to be observed. This is confirmed by Einstein, who says that mind and matter must arise together or not at all. Hence, all philosophical views that look upon the mind as evolved from matter are clearly wrong. The theory of relativity proves the simultaneous genesis of mind and matter quite conclusively. This confutes the biblical story of special creation, quite apart from the fact that it looks somewhat superfluous to call in an almighty God to create two illusions. For, is not the material world, including mind and matter, an illusion, dependent on the arising of causes? And now, finally, we come to an argument that is a favorite among theists. In Ceylon, it is known as the watchmaker argument. Here we are told that even so small and relatively simple a piece of machinery as a watch must have a maker. It cannot come into existence automatically, and so it follows, say the protagonists of the theory of God, that the universe with its complex balance of force, its wonders, stars, planets, and other celestial bodies working in perfect coordination, must have had a creator. But there are many objections to this argument, a few of which we shall consider here. For instance, who ever heard of any watchmaker coming into existence automatically? If we are therefore to be logical, this should apply equally to the universe maker as well. He too must have had a maker, who in his turn must have had a maker, and so on. The argument ends in futility, for where is one to stop? Now can we ever find a watchmaker who made a watch out of absolutely nothing? How, then, can we think of an universe maker who achieved this impossible feat? On the assumption, however, that he too, like our watchmaker, had materials. From where did he obtain his materials? Had these materials any prior existence? On the watchmaker theory, if we are to regard this as an argument at all, we are led inevitably to the conclusion that the universe was built not by one universe maker, but by several of them. We find that even so simple a mechanism as a watch is the work of creation of several people, each one a specialist in his own branch of activity. On this analogy, the universe, if ever it was created by a conscious and intelligent agency, would have had a large body of people working for that agency. There would have then been a team of makers rather than one sole maker, a syndicate in fact. The purpose of mentioning this point of view is not as an argument in support of a syndicate or agency as the creating force of the universe, but merely to point out that it is a logical conclusion, perfectly consistent with the data provided, and the reasoning sought to be applied thereto by reference to the watchmaker theory. The Buddha has, however, spoken of gods. In Buddhist cosmology, there are many gods. They are called devas. He taught the hard truth that these gods, too, like us human beings, are subject to decay and death, as the inexorable law of change applies to gods, inasmuch as it does to men. The gods live long, much longer than humans, because of their own good karma. Some of these gods are very powerful. Again, this is a result of their own good karma, and this fact should not surprise anyone and create the impression of omnipotence. For, do we not find even among us humans, some who are endowed with much power, some with much wisdom, and so forth? Unfortunately, as with most humans, gods too sometimes imagine that since they live long and very powerful, they will continue as they are through eternity. And when the hard day comes of separation from their lofty pedestals, with the exhaustion of the karma force that propelled them into positions, once again there is grief, pain, lamentation, suffering, and misery at the prospect of having to give up what they prized so much and held before. The greatest fallacy from which the gods themselves suffer is this erroneous belief that they will live forever. They do not realize that their glory will not last forever and will cease with the expending of their karma or merit. They are lulled into a sense of full security and complacency owing to their longevity and power. But in time, the gods too must die, and are once again reborn into some other phenomenal state, in keeping with the law of karma. For, just as cattle die, so do men in their fellies, and gods too must one day die, because they also are conditioned beings, not as yet having attained the supreme, unconditioned state of Nibbana, which alone can provide immunity from the recurring cycles of birth and death. The gods often suffer from self-complacency, and in their ignorance, they appear, from time to time, among men and mislead them by urging them to endeavor to reach the god states. It is a case of the blind leading the blind. But it must be understood that the Buddha's denial of God is only in respect of a supreme being as creator, vanquisher, and controller of the universe. There is no such deity, omnipotent and unchanging, even in Nibbana, the highest goal of Buddhism. For Nibbana is soulless, or without the substratum of self-void of even a causeless cosmic power. This is admirably brought out without ambiguity and doubt, by the use of the word Dhamma in the third line of the Buddha's own words. Sabi Sank are anika, all component things are transient. Sabi Sankha dukkha, all component things are sorrowful. Sabi Dhamma anatta, all mundane and supramundane things are soulless.